in some circumstances also there's more relapse, because hand in hand with this graft versus host disease is what we call a graft versus leukemia effect. And so patients, this graft attacks patient's skin and liver, but also attacks the patient's leukemia and prevents to a certain degree relapse. And what one will see is, one of the challenges in bone marrow transplant has been to maintain this graft versus leukemia effect while avoiding this graft versus host disease. And I don't think in the 20 years that I've done that, we're closer to that, but we're not there. And you will find subtle variations in transplant procedures in centers throughout the US and throughout the world, because different centers have slight differences and nobody has found the exact optimal way of doing it. Just as an aside, transplant is transplant, but transplant is very different from bone marrow transplant. It's very different from organ transplantation, where we rarely see this, if ever. Why is that? In an organ transplant, one does not give the immune system of the donor. One gives a kidney of a donor. One gives a liver of the donor, not the immune system. So the major complication of organ transplant is just the opposite. It's host versus graft disease, meaning the patient's immune system rejecting the graft, so true graft rejection. It's exactly the opposite and very different. As a consequence, solid organ transplant patients, and I think it's somewhat important to mention this, patients who have kidney transplant tend to stay on their cyclosporin lifelong, because the graft rejection practically never goes away. If you stop it, we may be able, or they may be able to take some patients off. Here, if we can avoid, in bone marrow transplant, if we can avoid the graft versus host disease, most patients end up being without these immune suppressants after either 3 months, 6 months, sometimes 2 years. I've had a couple of patients who needed it for 5 to 10 years, but practically everybody over time can come off. This is graft versus host disease of the skin. All these red blotches. This is somebody's ears who are inflamed. This is hands that are inflamed. These are pretty severe cases. We try to avoid this type of thing. If this gets any worse, if this gets any worse, people get blisters sometimes, which we practically always avoid these days. This is then the point that I try to make, that there's also graft versus leukemia effect associated with this. But let me skip that. Let me talk about a second very practical issue: infections after donor transplant. Infections are the second major issue after donor transplant, and the risk for infections is huge in the first month after the transplant, because with this transplant, and again some of you may have gone through it, but with this transplant we really give heavy chemotherapy, we eradicate the leukemia or whatever other cancer, but we also eradicate blood production. Then we give those patients a stem cell graft from a donor. It takes 2 weeks to grow. Patients have for 2 weeks no white blood cells, no defense against infection. We have people on antibiotics for a long time and patients are typically in the hospital until they recover. Now, after patients are out of the hospital, that donor immune system now is there and has to defend them against infections, but it has not grown up yet. It's not ready yet to take on all challenges. And in addition, we give them all these drugs like cyclosporin to prevent these infections. But we also suppress the immune system because of that. So patients remain at risk for a variety of infections, bacterial, viral, fungal, for a long time. I think any donor transplant patient needs to be, even if everything goes well, even if everything is perfect, and even if we are 2 years later, the risk for serious infection remains somewhat higher than another person. So a big message to every transplant patient is, take everything very, very seriously. When one has a problem 5 years after transplant and a fever, when I have a fever, I say, listen, I'm going to stay home for a day. Nobody needs to know. When a transplant patient has a fever, they'd better let somebody know, be it a donor transplant patient, be it 2 years, be it 3 years after transplant. The risk for infection, if a transplant goes well, and many transplant goes well, the risk for serious infection goes dramatically down after 3 months, after 6 months. Many of my patients have a perfectly healthy life, do all that anybody else does, but still I keep telling them, listen, call if you have a problem rather than wait a week. Don't ignore your problems, don't ignore infections. Things go back to almost normal, particularly after we stop all the cyclosporin, after we stop all the tacrolimus. Until then, they remain, and I don't want to go through this is all very technical, but patients remain on a number of antibacterials, antifungals, Bactrim, and I'm sure for those of you who have gone through a transplant, the physicians here do all this. These things are quite standard actually throughout the world. But then other things come up. What do I eat? How much risk is there with food? That's a question that I at least get all the time. And how do I deal with people who are sick? How do I deal? I tried to think of some practical issues that may come up. So food, at least the recommendations right now are less strict than they used to be. There's new CDC recommendations. We told everybody to avoid all vegetables and all raw vegetables and all fruit. I don't think that really is based in much scientific basis. And people. We say now, okay, wash them very carefully. Avoid, and in this country, but also in the States, we eat a lot of raw meat. We eat particularly a lot of sushi. Stay away from that. Sushi can be quite dangerous, although I like it. A lot of people like it. But greasy foods, dairy products can cause diarrhea. That's more, and can cause stomach upset. This, to me, is very important and difficult for the patients. Every year we have 1 or 2 patients in the first year after transplant who have serious problems with flu virus, or with common one is RSV virus. A big culprit there are little kids. People, and I don't know what to tell my patients. Well, I know what to tell my patients. School-aged kids harbors, carry infections around left and right. They get it from one another in the school. And a lot of my patients are grandparents these days. I tell them, keep the grandparents out, keep the kids out of the house until we're 6 months after the transplant. And if they have a cold, please keep them out of the house. You'll deal with them. You'll be happy to see them later on. But it's kind of every winter. Here it's winter season now, but our winter season is a different time of the year. But every winter I have 2 or 3 patients who have these types of problems. People tell me, what about plants and flowers? Flowers carry fungus. Fungus is a big risk. As long as they don't touch them, I think it's okay. If you want to take all your flowers out of the house and your plants, I think it's a little bit impossible, because then you'll step out and there's still pollen in the air, and so I don't think it's 100% realistic. But I do tell my patients not to go gardening, not to dig into the soil. And if they do that even 2 years after their transplant, and I've seen some weird, the soil is full of fungus. Fungus is mushrooms, and the soil is full everywhere of, even 2 years after transplant. If you want to do gardening, use gloves.